Good evening, I'm Anchal Vora and you're watching Gravitas. Is Russia talking to the Taliban? What happened to China's efforts to bring the Taliban on the negotiating table? Should India consider opening a channel of communication with the Taliban? Also, later in the show, how the United States seems concerned about India's maritime might to take on China. But first, the headlines. Reports say Russia has conducted talks with the Taliban at least twice. Is it the fear of ISIS or the will to regain control? Territory lost to America. The United States is concerned, it seems, about India's Navy, specifically deficiencies in its indigenous aircraft carrier program. A recent report in the Wall Street Journal said US Navy experts were convinced India cannot counter the Chinese Navy in the near future. India's former Air Force Chief S.P. Tyagi was arrested along with his cousin for allegedly abusing his position in the multi-crore Augusta-Westland VIP chopper deal. 2 days after Syrian government forces retake almost whole of East Aleppo, first pictures emerged of the devastation caused inside the besieged city. A WION special report. We travel to a border security force post in Jammu and Kashmir in India at a time tensions between India and Pakistan continue. The great game again. According to reports, Russia has started talking to the Taliban, perhaps because it sees ISIS as a bigger enemy, or perhaps because it sees eye to eye with Iran on reducing the American role in a country that it has historically tried to, what some would say, control. Have a look at this story.
It takes two to tango, but reports about Russia's tango with the Afghan Taliban are raising more than eyebrows in Kabul and the region. For one, the Afghan government claims the Taliban shadow governor of Kunduz province crossed over into Tajikistan for a meeting with the Russians. They also say a Taliban delegation traveled to Moscow for another unpublicized meeting. But the most worrisome are hints of new Russian-made anti-aircraft guns with the Taliban. That would be a first and could be a game-changer, as attacks by the Afghan government's fighter aircraft and helicopters can now be countered. Russia dismisses the claims, saying that there are no intensive contacts with the Taliban, but that it talks to all the players in Afghanistan and that it does so to protect its own interests. Russian analysts also say that they see the Taliban as a lesser evil compared to the Islamic State in Afghanistan. They say its radical ideology could spread to Russia's soft underbelly comprising of Tajikistan, Uzbekistan and Turkmenistan. These countries could be seriously destabilized. But the Taliban say they have had contacts with the Russians since 2007, when the Islamic State was nowhere in Afghanistan. The point they are trying to make is, quote, "We needed support to get rid of the United States and its allies in Afghanistan, and Russia wanted all foreign troops to leave Afghanistan as quickly as possible," unquote. Given that, it would seem that the Russians have been reading the Afghan tea leaves very closely and have serious doubts about the current government of President Ghani, and given the Taliban resurgence in 22 provinces, are looking at the future. Bureau Report, WION.
Let's introduce our panel. Sergei Strokin, a Russian journalist, is joining us on the phone line. Nandan Unnikrishnan, expert on strategic affairs, will join us from Delhi. Afghan journalist is going to be joining us. Mr. Nouri is going to be joining us in a short while via Skype. There he is. Atul Aneja, journalist in China, again, is joining us on the phone line. And Glenn Carl, former CIA operative, somebody who's worked quite a lot in the Afghanistan region, is going to be joining us also via Skype. Let me quickly get an opinion from Russia first on the story, and then we jump into the debate. Sergei, thanks very much for speaking to WION. How would you respond to this report? What is Russia's official stand when it comes to stories like these that suggest that Russia is talking to the Taliban?
Thanks for having me. Of course, the talk of the day is those reports which are circulated by regional media over alleged Russia's contacts with Taliban. Well, it's difficult to say how credible are those sources which you're referring to. I'm not in a position to say whether those contacts took place or not. Russia's official position is that there are no any negotiations with Taliban. But I think that from the very start we have to say when we talk about Taliban, we are stepping on a slippery slope because there's a lot of confusion over the terminology. What is Taliban? You know that there are moderate Taliban, there's radical Taliban. If you look at Pakistan, but some Taliban is ready to pay loyalty to Islamic State. Terrorists, others are still sticking to the initial project. That's why there's a lot of confusion with the term in itself. But I can add to that also that while Russia is categorically denying that it has any contacts with Taliban, and there's certain logic in that because Russia, as you know, establishes and develops official ties with governments in Kabul and Islamabad. We can't obviously rule out that there are some contacts with some opposition groups, but even if they take place, I'm not saying that they take place, but even if they take place, obviously this is not contacts with terrorists, with radicals, but with those groups which potentially can be involved in political mainstream.
I understand what you're saying, Sergei. You're saying that if it may not be with those who are armed, but perhaps some of the political representatives of the Taliban or others. Now, before I go to our other Russian guest, Vladimir Stoyanov, is the head of Russia East-West Center, known as an independent think tank in Russia. Before that, I'd like to ask my production team to play visuals of this shadow governor of Taliban in Kunduz. His name is Mullah Abdul Salam. This person has reportedly conducted talks with the officials of Russia in a Central Asian nation. That's what we've learned in Tajikistan. The report suggests that this person is a shadow governor of the Taliban in Kunduz in Afghanistan, and he's conducted talks with Russian officials in Tajikistan. Let's go to Mr. Vladimir now. He's an analyst. Thanks very much, sir, for speaking to WION. I'd like to ask you, amid such reports emerging, there is this belief that Russia thinks ISIS is a bigger threat, and because ISIS exists and several boys from Russia have moved to ISIS territory, Russia is perhaps trying to play an act where they want to open some sort of a communication channel with Taliban so they could perhaps use Taliban against ISIS. How would you respond to that?
Thank you very much for having me as a guest in your show. Let me say that some time ago, there were some unconfirmed reports by some Western media that allegedly Russia has some contacts with some opposition groups. They hinted in these reports in Western media that even there might be, as they said, the contacts between Russia and the so-called Taliban groups. As my colleague Sergei said, we first of all should think that should say that Taliban is a different organization. I mean, Taliban consists of different groups, and so because this is unconfirmed reports, I don't think there much reliability lies behind these reports actually. But because Russia, what Russia is doing actually, Russia is maintaining contacts on the future peaceful process in Afghanistan with the government in Islamabad, because as we know that Russia has a good relationship now with Islamabad, as well as the government of President Ghani in Kabul. So I think that we shall see what goes next and what will surface in the future, because it's still very preliminary to say that Russia has contacts with Taliban.
Right, so you know, officially, allow me to come in, sir, but do continue to stay with us. Officially, governments do one thing, but unofficially, perhaps there are measures that governments take, and you know that better than I do. Let's pull up some information for our viewers. According to the report, Russia is talking to the Taliban, and the report suggests the Taliban met Russia in Tajikistan and also in Moscow. The Reuters report says that Russia says contact with the Taliban to bring them to the negotiating table. The report also says that Taliban says Russian support is only moral and political, and that they're not being provided with any arms and ammunition or any other financial support from Russia, and that United States feel Moscow is lending legitimacy to the Taliban. Let's go to our American guest, Glenn Carl, somebody who's worked in Afghanistan quite extensively, former intelligence officer, also a part of the CIA earlier, I believe. Sir, I'd like to start by asking you, how do you see this? Do you see that Russia is perhaps trying to regain control of a country that it has historically wanted control of? We know very well the history of Afghanistan. How do you see this report that suggests that Russia is in fact engaging the Taliban?
Well, I think the word control might thank you for having me, by the way, but I think the word control might overstate the objectives a little bit, but is not wrong. You know, Afghanistan is one of the great losers or victims in world history with the Kurds, let's say. It's in the interest of Pakistan, of India, and of Russia that Afghanistan always be weak. It's also in the interest of Russia that it take whatever steps it needs to secure itself from the threat of jihadists in neighboring countries or in the Russian Federation itself. So it makes perfect sense. And in fact, Russian intelligence officers would be derelict if they were not talking to everybody. No one has a friend or an enemy, or rather I should say that you always talk to your enemies anyway. But one of the Russian gentlemen made a good point. You know, what is the Taliban? They are not a monolith. There are all sorts of different factions. It's very tribal. And the objective is, on top of all of this, in addition for Russia to secure itself from jihadist threat, to eliminate the influence of the United States, which is in an irritating place geographically in Afghanistan. So it makes perfect sense. And if it's not happening, I will fall over and faint.
Let me go to the Afghan guest, journalist Nouri there. Mr. Nouri, how would you look at this? Now, the theatre of war in Afghanistan over the last 2 years has certainly shifted from the south to the north, which is closer to the Central Asian nations, and in that sense presents imminent danger to Russian security as well. Would you say it does make sense for Russia? Would you agree with Glenn there for Russia to also engage some factions of the Taliban?
Well, let me first of all begin with an update. The journalist from Russia, my two friends, who said, you know, that reports, unconfirmed reports or anything. Last night in the national TV, in a press conference, the Russian ambassador publicly announced that they are holding talks with the Taliban. So there's no denial of that. And what I see is, you know, it's a great game, as the other panelist from the CIA mentioned. It's a great game of the past. In the 80s, Russian did American did whatever they could to bring Russia to its knees, and then which eventually resulted in the collapse of communist regime in that country. Now it's a good opportunity for them. If it was an imminent threat in terms of, you know, the Taliban going from the in a sense from south to north, the best way the Russian could do was to support the Afghan government to eliminate the entire network of terrorists rather than just picking one. And now here, if you help a terrorist group in terms of what the ambassador mentioned, you know, that we hold talks with the Russian because, with the Taliban, because we want our political branches in the country and our politicians or diplomats to be safe from them. So now the Taliban is not a child. Of course, they know that they benefit. What will they give in return? The most important thing, let alone ammunition, funds, whatever, the most important thing the Russian gives the Taliban is the intelligence information about particular targets. In return, what they do is they don't touch them.
Right, Mr. Nouri, let me take that. I think you've raised two very important points. I'd love to go to my Russian guest now. Mr. Vladimir, I'd like to come to you first. Journalist Nouri is giving us an update. He's saying that Russian ambassador in Afghanistan has publicly stated that Russia is indeed engaging with factions of the Taliban. How would you respond to that, sir?
Well, what I can say, actually, regarding all this information, because as I said already, that this is unconfirmed reports, and then there are much doubt in their credibility and reliability. I think we should just wait till official confirmation on behalf of the Russian government officials, because otherwise it seems that like some actually rumors and some other things like unconfirmed reports are surfacing in the media space. So all I can say is that we should wait till any official confirmation from the representatives of the Russian government.
All right, now let's also have a look at some other information that we've collated as far as when you do try and talk to Taliban, or when you try to bring the Taliban on the negotiating table with the Afghan government, what happens? China tried to do that. China hosts Taliban in May 2015 in Sinkiang region. Chinese, Afghan and Pakistani representatives met the Taliban delegation. China apparently did this at the behest of Pakistan, also because China is concerned about ETIM in Pakistan, a terror group that targets China. The Taliban in turn has assured Beijing that they won't attack Chinese-funded INAC mine project. Is there more to it? Let's get our guest from China now in. Senior journalist Atul Raneja joins us on the phone line. Mr. Raneja, thanks again for joining WION. I'd like to ask you first, how did it really go when China tried to bring the Taliban on the negotiating table? How did that go?
Well, you see, for the Chinese, Afghanistan becomes a very important theater. This goes back to the killing of Osama bin Laden, because that led to the withdrawal of the Americans, creating a vacuum in a way. And the quadrilateral mechanism which was formed after that, which involved the Americans and the Pakistanis, the Taliban and the Chinese, that also went defunct with the killing of Baitullah Masood while he was returning from Iran. So in a way, the Chinese feel that a vacuum is emerging in Afghanistan, which is detrimental to their very vital strategic interests, because west of Afghanistan, you have the Xinjiang region, which you mentioned, and for China's energy security, the West East pipelines are passing through Xinjiang. So if there's any kind of terrorist activity which takes place in Xinjiang, radiating from Afghanistan, that is a mortal threat to China's energy security and its industrial belt in Shanghai and the East Coast. So for the Chinese, stability in Afghanistan has become vital. And in this larger context, they are engaging with each and every actor possible which can sort of keep the situation in a state of calm. And it was in that context that the contacts with the Taliban were also established. And I'm not surprised that they are, because every country, and I suspect even the Russians, have back-channel contacts with all players, which does not mean that it becomes a zero-sum game, that you engage only them and not engage the governments which are in power. So this is a very natural process we should face, but given the stakes of security and the vital national interests, especially the Chinese and also the Russians that are involved, I'm not surprised either with the Chinese engaging with the Taliban or with the Russians establishing back-channel contacts.
Right. So in that sort of a scenario, what should India be doing? Let's go to Nandan Unnikrishnan. He's been a journalist, an analyst. We often talk to Mr. Unnikrishnan, especially when it comes to Russia. But sir, I'd like to get your perspective first on the report, and then we'll talk a little about what India should be doing vis-a-vis opening a communication channel with the Taliban or not. But first, your perspective on this report that's come out, that Russia is in fact engaging the Taliban. The report goes on to suggest that Russia has been doing this since 2007.
Well, Anchal, thank you firstly for having me on your show. The second point is, I really, it amazes me that we are getting our knickers in a twist about the Russians talking to the Taliban. We don't mind the Iranians talking to Taliban. We don't say anything about Chinese talking to Taliban. We don't say anything about Americans talking to Taliban. But if the Russians start talking to Taliban, then we seem to think that this is a great betrayal. Now, here I would say that it is reflective of our mentality, where we expect Russia to unquestioningly support our point of view on everything that deals with our the South Asian region, as well as vis-a-vis Pakistan. However, if you look at it, Russia has its own national interests, and Afghanistan is a vital area as far as Russia is concerned. And since, in their view, there is no solution, no stable solution to the Afghan problem without involving Pakistan, they want to build up some kind of leverage in Islamabad. So the Indians cannot provide them that leverage. So it seems rational for them to try and establish independent relationships with Islamabad as well as with the Taliban. However, now coming back to what you were saying about India, what would worry me deeply is the fact that in Russia it appears that there is a struggle going on between 2 points of view, something that last happened way back in the early 90s, between those who want a more balanced approach towards India and Pakistan, and between those who see India as a primary strategic ally of Russia. Now that, I think, is of much greater consequence to us and something that we should be concentrating and dealing with rather than whether Russia is talking to the Taliban or not.
Right, sir. You did talk about Iran, that is not spoken of. I think the fact that Iran has been engaging Taliban, these reports have emerged, is certainly shocking. Let's pull up that information for our viewers. The Taliban attended, reportedly, Islamic Vigilance Conference in Iran. Tayyab Agha, the former head of the Taliban office in Qatar, visited Iran as well. Taliban chief Mullah Mansour was killed after he returned from Iran. There are reports that suggest that Taliban Shura also has an office in the Iranian city of Zahedan. And the Taliban killed at least 8 Iranian diplomats in Afghanistan in the 90s. And that is what sort of makes this quite interesting. At that time, Iran had put 70,000 plus soldiers on its border with Afghanistan. Despite that, it seems that even Iran is going ahead and engaging. The question here is not quite what India thinks about Russia talking to Taliban, but more about what Afghanistan itself thinks. Let me go to all my panelists again. But first up, Afghan journalist, my Afghan colleague, Mr. Nouri. We were talking about the Afghan perspective to this. How do you see, when we're talking about Iran's engaging the Taliban, Russian guests say they're not engaging the Taliban, but perhaps a few segments of it. Glenn says he's not surprised at all. What's the Afghan perspective here? Nouri.
Well, Achal, the Afghan perspective is, that as your other panelist from the CIA mentioned, he wrote a bit of a wrong word, which was Afghans are the loser, but I would say Afghans are the victims of the proxy war between various superpowers, starting from United States and Russia, Iran and Saudi Arabia, Pakistan and India, all of these. Unfortunately, recently, we don't have what we should have is, the economical stability. If we don't have economical stability, whoever wants to just pay the factors, they will just turn towards them. In terms of, Taliban dealing with Iran or Iran supporting the Taliban, it's more of the same scenario that now Russians are using, because the ISIS are anti-Shiite and then they don't want to do that one.
But Mr. Nouri, my question is, the Afghan government itself is trying to talk to the Taliban and says that Pakistan is meddling in and is not letting them talk to their brethren. So in that sense, can you accuse these countries who also have their security interest at stake if they do try and engage what they call sections of the Taliban?
That's the point. For instance, the recent development, Russia, China, and Pakistan wants to talk with the Taliban, boycotting the actual government, the Afghan government, who is in the center of attacks of these people. So my point would be, if they want, they need to support a talk between the Afghan government and its the group that's fighting against it. So if you support the central government, that will become more powerful, and then the Taliban will have no option but to come to negotiation table. But if you keep supporting them, providing ammunition, why would they come for that one? Because remember, at the end of the day, it's a game of, making money for some people in the Taliban, same as in other factors. The security is, of course, it's of concern. But if the Afghan government becomes strong, then there won't be any the troops. And if they defeat the Taliban and the ISIS, whatever other troops are against it, if the regional powers support the Afghan government, they will enable the government to defeat them rather than just supporting those people to fight the Afghan government naming it, because we're doing it for our own security interest. It's an obvious interference into others' affairs.
And a lot of it, Mr. Nouri, would depend on also a factor that certainly cannot be ignored. Any discussion we have on Afghanistan is what Donald Trump is going to be doing, the president-elect. That is going to be deciding the Afghan future to quite an extent as well. Now, during his presidential campaign and before that, there's been quite a flip-flop. Listen into this.
Afghanistan is a total and complete disaster. What are we doing? We have all of these horrible events taking place there. Get out of Afghanistan. We've wasted billions and billions of dollars, and more importantly, thousands and thousands of lives.
We made a terrible mistake getting involved there in the first place. We had real brilliant thinkers that didn't know what the hell they were doing, and it's a mess. It's a mess. Afghanistan is a different thing. It's next to Pakistan, and Pakistan has nuclear weapons, okay?
Let's go to Glenn Carl. Glenn, we've heard what Donald Trump has said. Maybe what he wants to do, what he finally does, in fact, would change when he does become the president and he has a solid team of the advisors. But what about Mad Dog? How do we now give us perspective as to what would his plans likely be when it comes to dealing with Afghanistan?
Yeah, I actually find I find little encouraging, as I think other previous listeners will have discerned from my perspective, little encouraging about what's happening in the American political world. But to the extent there is something relatively reassuring, I think General Mattis is. Now, he may be hardline and seek to impose a stronger military solution, unquote, in Afghanistan than others might. However, he's a rational and experienced actor. So my sense, and I really don't know, to read those tea leaves is pretty difficult right now about the American direction in the coming months. But I would expect he will be reflexively and deeply hostile to moves that Russia would take to create problems for the United States in Afghanistan. He would seek to strengthen the stability and the success of the Afghan government. He would oppose the Taliban. He would work with Pakistan and view them nonetheless as duplicitous, which is an accurate assessment of our relations with the state for decades. And so you might have a strengthened policy of support for the Afghan government if he were to have his way, but he is not the president.
And what about this bromance? I'm sorry to interrupt, but we're running out of time, and I do want your perspective on this as well. What about the bromance that's on between Donald Trump and Putin? Donald Trump has spoken about how he would let Russia take the lead when it comes to Syria and regions. What about Afghanistan?
I don't know how that would play out in Afghanistan, but the affinity of Donald Trump and the ties that Donald Trump has that have been established by journalists, intelligence services, and so on with Russia, I find profoundly disturbing. It's fine for the United States to have allies of or friends of circumstance with anybody. That's how countries function. But to reflexively side with the Russian leadership rather than the intelligence services, the counterintelligence services, the national security services, and the diplomatic services of the United States and of foreign countries, all of which have found disturbing associations, I find profoundly disturbing, far greater concern for an American than what America might do in Afghanistan.
All right, let me get a quick final word from all our guests. If we do have the Russians still on the phone line, let me go to Mr. Vladimir. Sir, I'd like to ask you just a final word. Do you think it is completely out of order if Russia is trying to reach out to some of the factions of the Taliban?
Again, actually, unfortunately, these reports actually about alleged Russian participation in any negotiations with Taliban is, as I said already, on the level of press reports, unconfirmed reports, and other things. So I think that ultimately, I think that for the future of Afghanistan, for the future of the peace process in the region, including such countries as Afghanistan, Iran, Pakistan, and India, and two great powers like Russia and the United States under the future president to be Donald Trump. Probably actually the common effort to bring everybody.
Right. Got your point, sir. Got your point. I think you.
This is just the time is a disaster. So sorry, let me just finalize my point of view.
Sure.
So, to bring everybody to the negotiation table and to work out the reliable plan of peace in this country.
Right, sir. Thanks very much. It seems that everybody, all the other countries except for Afghanistan, wouldn't want talks with the Taliban. If they would, then through them only and not strengthening Taliban in any which way. Last word to Nandan Unnikrishnan, and before that, just little information placard that we prepared. What should India do then? India certainly not talking to the Taliban. There have been certain rumors, perhaps some people in the diplomatic community think so. Members of the Taliban expressed their desire to speak to India. I have myself interviewed Tayyab Agha's cousin, who says no issues in talking to India. India supported Northern Alliance against Pakistan. As Pakistan supported the Taliban, India won't upset Afghanistan government at any cost and exercises anyway little leverage over the Taliban. Nandan, a final word to you. Should India start playing with that idea more? Or, I mean, they don't have to make it public, but should they entertain that idea a little more or no?
Firstly, I would not be surprised if we have informal contacts with the Taliban already, point one. Point two, this is just an aside to Glenn. I'd like to remind him that it's the US intelligence services that provided Mr. Colin Powell with evidence of weapons of mass destruction in Iraq. And we all know how that went. So Donald Trump being skeptical is not surprising. Point number three is that as far as India is concerned, Russian policy on Afghanistan is very important. It is vital for us to be on the same page, given that we have a strategic partnership. But it is also reflective of a deeper malaise that seems to be affecting our bilateral relationship. What we need to do is have much more open, serious, frank discussions with Russians on all aspects of our bilateral relationship. And do remember that we actually have a joint committee that looks at Afghanistan, where we exchange intelligence and all. We need to reactivate all these and establish much, much closer contact.
Big thank you to all my guests. Glenn joined us from Washington. Thank you, Glenn, for joining us. Nouri from London. Thanks very much to my Russian guests, Vladimir and Sergei, for bringing us that perspective. And I'd like to thank as well Nandan Unnikrishnan and Atul Aneja. We couldn't come to you as often as we would have liked to, but there'll certainly be another time. Let's take a break. I come back with the next topic we're discussing, which talks about how the United States seems a bit too concerned about India's maritime might. Can India take on China in the seas? That is up next.